Hey, what's up? Glad to have you listening here for another edition of Daily Scone. And I was reminded today of a topic I've talked about to different college students in the past. And I wanted to briefly discuss it today on the podcast. Very glad you're here as always. Hit the subscribe button if you haven't yet. Rate us. That's our bargain every day, our compromise. You rate us, you subscribe, and I promise I'll post content here every single day that hopefully gives you a better idea of what we do in sports media. And if maybe you're an aspiring sports media member, this provides you with a bit of insight and maybe a bit of a resource for you as you get started in your career. And even if you're in your career, it's never too late to learn. I'd like to think that I learn every day. I always try to keep my eye on people that I respect and how they do their job to see if there's things that I could pick up to be better at what it is that I do. But as I've recorded the podcast, I got a note from a friend who used to be a professor at LSU and now is a professor at Niagara in New York. And he sent me a note saying, "Hey man, really enjoying the podcast." And he would invite me every semester to speak to his classes, sports management classes. And Patrick Tuck, I don't think he'd mind me saying his name. And he sent me a note and he was like, "Hey man, really enjoying the podcast. I appreciate what you're doing." And he said, "I love the Buzzy the Bee story," because that's one I would always share with his classes. And if you haven't heard that podcast, it was sort of about humble beginnings and humbling yourself to get your foot in the door to be able to get better opportunities when they come along. It's a previous episode. I'd highly recommend you go back and listen to it. I'd highly recommend you go back and listen to all of them if you could. But nonetheless, so he said the Buzzy the Bee, and then something else that he reminded me of that I would talk about with his classes, and understanding that in these sports management classes, a lot of times there were athletes, like college athletes, in these classes. In some instances, college athletes that I would cover. And one of the things that we talked about in those classes was the difference between, in an opinion, the difference between amateur athletes and professional athletes. And for me, there is a very big difference. Because my hard and fast rule is that I will never criticize an amateur athlete, college or high school athlete. I will, and there are gray areas of gray, and I'll elaborate a little bit more. But as a general rule, I won't go on air, and if the starting point guard is 2 for 10 from 3 and misses the game-winning shot, I won't go on air the next day and talk about how awful he is and they need to revoke his scholarship because he's a terrible shooter and I can't believe he's a D1 basketball player, and just sort of vent emotionally about that player. I think there's a certain tact that you have to take when discussing it, because you can't avoid the topic and you can't avoid the issue. But I think there's also a certain way, and if you're going to put yourself in the public light, there is the argument that if you're going to put yourself out there publicly, then you're opening yourself up to criticism. And in some sense, that's very fair. But I also think there's a difference when you're being compensated for it. And the whole argument of, is a scholarship and cost of attendance compensation, we can have that argument another day. But the bottom line is, at its most basic level, professional athletes are getting paid to do their job, and amateur athletes are not. So in my mind, there is a difference. Now, to do your job well, at times, you've got to be able to call a spade, but how you handle things, I think, does matter. So let me give you an example, okay, of how I might have handled something that I didn't, okay, because I wasn't in media at the time. But this is just one that comes to mind. And it was very obvious. So in 1994, LSU was playing a football game at Auburn. Jamie Howard was the quarterback, and LSU was not very good, and they hadn't been good for a while, and Auburn was really good. And the game was at Auburn, and LSU was winning in the fourth quarter, and it looked like, for all intents and purposes, that LSU was going to win this game on the road and upset Auburn on the Plains, and it was going to be a great win and all that stuff. Well, Jamie Howard threw 4 interceptions in the fourth quarter, and I'm pretty sure 3 of them were returned for touchdowns. That was an epic day of ineptitude in the history of LSU football, and people still talk about it, and they reference the interception game in the Auburn series and how that all went down. Well, I think about, and obviously I was just a high school student, or junior high at that point, but I think about how I might have handled that if something like that were to happen today, and what I would say on the air. And most likely how I would approach it is something along the lines of, man, I'm sure that nobody feels worse about what happened than Jamie Howard. Guy's not out there trying to throw interceptions and certainly doesn't want to lose the game. At some point, though, if you're the coaching staff, I think you have to intervene. And you have to say one of two things. Either one, you got a big lead, why are you still throwing the football? And two, if you have a player that's struggling, why not look at another option? And I think, in that instance, and obviously I could elaborate on all the points, but what you've done there is you didn't avoid the conversation, which is the most obvious part of that game. You certainly pointed out that it was not good what happened, which is obvious. You're not completely deflecting the blame from the player, but at the same time, it's not going on air and saying Jamie Howard is probably the worst college quarterback that LSU has ever had. The fact that he's on scholarship and throws 4 interceptions in a quarter is so awful. I can't believe they would even let him on the bus after the game to fly back with the team. They probably should have kicked him off the team right then and never let him back on a practice field. So so you can understand like the approach between the two. And just my own personal preference, I'm not sure that I would take that tact even with a professional player. But if something similar happened in the NFL, then, you have to talk about, or in a professional league, like you have to talk openly about people's job status. Because you have to discuss things like salary cap. And of course there's roster limits and there's cut down days. And it's like, okay, well, if you're choosing between these two players, who would you cut? You're essentially giving your opinion of who should be fired. I mean, can you imagine whatever you do in life if someone walked into your office and they were analyzing like if you or Jim in accounting should be fired? It's a very awkward thing, but it's very much a part of the job. So, when we're talking about like the Saints in training camp and they got to cut their roster to 53 and it's down to these two players, well then I got to give a case why I would want that player instead of that player, essentially making the case for why that guy should lose his job. So there is, in my opinion, a different standard when you're talking about pro and college and how you address, and maybe you'd use the term kid gloves, and maybe it feels like to some that you're punting on the conversation, but I think there's a way, and I know there's a way that you can be stern, that you can get your point across without dogging a kid. And I know when I say that word, it's going to rub some people wrong. You're going to say they're not kid, they're adults. I think for all of us, if you really stop and remember what it was like to be 18 or 19 or 20 years old, like you could have a greater degree of empathy for college athletes. And the tough part is, and I know this because, man, like I see it. And up at the radio station every summer, we have LSU football players that intern with us through their work internship program. So, you get to interact with some of these guys away from football and away from the field, and you can understand just while physically they're very mature and they're enormous people and everything that you'd expect a major college athlete to be, you also understand that, that emotionally and from a maturity level, they're teenagers. They're maybe 20 years old. And most of us don't really do our most growing up until we hit stages and phases in life where we're forced to. When you get married, when you have a kid, when you have someone or someone else depending on you that you have to provide for and you have to be accountable. It just changes your level of maturity. It just forces you to be more mature. And I think sometimes because fans care so passionately about the teams that they follow, and it's so much more about the name on the front instead of the name of the back, because no matter how many times the names on the back change, you're always going to cheer for the name on the front. You lose sight sometime of the kid under the helmet. And the fact that, that's still an 18, 19, 20-year-old who's going to college, who's going to class, who's trying to do their best, and the overwhelming majority of them are never going to get paid to play football or whatever sport it may be. So I guess maybe the way I handle it is because I'm coming from a standpoint where, as a media member, you do interact with these players away from the field or the court or whatever it is they do. And in a sense, you get to know them and their personality a little more. And it's revealing that they are just young people. And so it's much more difficult to be intensely critical of them and what they're doing on the field. So I always try to be aware of that. You can be fair. You can be fair in critiques and you can be honest in your opinion, but you don't have to be overly critical to where you're dogging an amateur athlete. Now, the other side of that as well is high school. And for me, anything negative about a high school coach or athlete is completely off limits. I would say the most topic of conversation we've had on the show about a high school topic is with the Louisiana High School Athletic Association when they had this public-private split. And so I was very critical of the organization, of the LHSAA for that. Not any coach or any student athlete, certainly. But, as far as ever, I don't know why I would ever even bring up a topic of a high school, just in my market. Talking high school football wouldn't move the meter. It's just way too niche. Like, the people that would care about a specific school in general, like if you're breaking down a game, the people that care about that school in particular are just like the current students or alums of that school. It's not going to have broad appeal to talk about just one school. So I don't know why I would ever get into that into that realm. But I'll give you an example of someone who I did work with in the past who did a bit one time because a team lost 130-2 or whatever in basketball. It's just they got beaten really badly. So this person pulled the box score and just sort of made a bit out of it about how poorly they played, how bad they got beaten, and basically offered his services to coach. And it was a funny bit, but at the same time, for me, I'll tell you, I would never do something on air that would embarrass a high school athlete. That could embarrass a high school athlete because of what their team did on the field individually. So I think everyone has different standards, but for me, those are mine. I won't do a negative story ever about something that happened on the field involving a high school athlete. Like I would never criticize an athlete for their play on the field. With collegiate athletes, you have to be critical at times, certainly. You have to be honest. You have to give your opinion. You have to let your audience know that you're being genuine and sincere. But I think you also have to come at it with an awareness that you're not having a personal attack on a player specifically instead of maybe situationally what happened. And then in the NFL, I just think it's a different standard with professional athletes, and it seems like all bets are off, at least in my opinion. And being honest doesn't mean being an asshole, if you'll excuse the language. But you can get your point across without being just an overt a-hole, but you can still get your point across, and sometimes it is critical and it's opinions that people aren't going to like. So I hope that makes sense, and I hope that in your career, provided you're in media or if you have an ambition to go in media, you'll at least give it some thought and maybe look at how different media members that you respect in opinion media handle those situations differently. And come up with your own standard and be consistent by it. That's all I would say is maybe the most important thing is whatever that standard is, identify it, recognize it, and any time that you're going to broach a topic that would be critical of an athlete, just be consistent with that standard going in and actually give it some thought. So I hope that helps. As always, I say it every day, man. I love feedback. So if you have any, fire away. mattmoscona@gmail.com, MattMoscona, mattmoscona@gmail.com. I love getting your emails and your feedback. I'd love to hear from you. So by all means, let me know and subscribe to the podcast. I appreciate it greatly. And until next time.